a little bit more, but let me show you what I did. Second. Give me 1 second. Oh, yeah. Okay, so it says revised list. I made it real quick. Yeah, I want to make sure I get it out there. If you click this on Teams, it has the new list.
What's the redacted? Is that government? Is that secret government?
So I took a bunch off. I added 3. And I had presidential reconstruction, Plains Indian Wars. I was trying to fit it on a tiny piece of paper, so my handwriting is even more uniquer. And two factors in the Industrial Revolution. These would just be choices. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to make a couple columns with most of these, and you have to answer 2 columns, that would be like 6 each, and you have to answer 3 of them. So I'll give you 2 columns of 6 of this first one, so that's 6 total. So you got choices. The big point is you have good choices on it. And then the next one, I'm going to have 4 columns, and then same deal, 3 for each one.
So how many total?
Well, and then that'll be 18, and then I'm trying to decide I'm going to add 1 or 2. I have to split them. So I will give you choices, I promise.
How many multiple choice are there?
Short ID?
Just short.
I like that. Thank you very much.
I know it's more work in a way, but then again, you write what you know.
Did you
All right.
campaign for me?
And I posted this on Teams, but I got government laws. I pare everything down. We might not get to beast it, but we might. I don't know. And if we do, I adjust. So I will adjust it. I will give you good choices. You have plenty of choices. You write what you know. Good short IDs. How many sentences each?
3.
So those are the 3-sentence ones. Good sentences, obviously, but you know the routine. But I like tests like this. I think they're good. I liked it better when I was a student. Once I got over the additional work part and realized, no, wait a second, I can do better on this.
I like this stuff because I didn't worry about multiple choice, and it's like, wait, you say how many of those there are that I didn't worry about.
Now, the very next test we're going to do will be about 30 more. We got to get back to doing some more multiple choice. But that's all right, right?
I don't like the multiple choice.
I don't like them either.
College Board chooses to word it in the worst way possible. It's like they have scientists that are crafting.
No, they're just people who don't communicate with other people. They keep them in a basement, in a closet, and they don't talk to humans. So they write, they're just themselves, but they're imaginary friends. So he's the problem.
He does it for insurance board exams.
I know, and you gotta write them generic, and that makes it even worse. Okay. You moved. You've disrupted society. The earth is no longer tilted on the axis, but then Drew moved, so now everything's equaled out again. All right, so we are gonna have class. Let's get going. Okay, so did we get to the review list?
We ended on Wounded Knee.
Wounded Knee. Let's do Wounded Knee then. So we did the ghost dance, which is so sad, and so we were right here. So they started fleeing the cavalry, and by the way, the temperature that night before Wounded Knee was 35 below. And so I'm thinking today we're out there is 23 below. So imagine colder and being out in the middle. It's sort of just miserable. And it was only a couple hundred stragglers. And they sent the entire U.S. 7th Cavalry. They outnumbered the stragglers. And this is the cavalry that was humiliating a Little Bighorn. They had a number of weapons with them. They didn't have a Little Bighorn. Rapid fire small cannon small guns called Hotchkiss guns. And this weapon invented in the Revolutionary War, but Custer actually declined to take, called a Gatling gun. You know what a Gatling gun is? It has 6 barrels, and you actually turn the barrels by hand, but each time the barrel came up, a bullet went in the breech and fired. You could fire about 200 rounds a minute. It jammed a lot, but still put out a lot of lead. And it's a precursor to a machine gun, in a way. Well, when they stopped, the U.S. Army decided to disarm them. They basically said, you're going to be disarmed and led back. In the process of disarming them, a shot went off. Somebody, it was almost certainly one of the people from Standing Rock. They absolutely shot fired off. And next thing you know, a couple shots fired, and the cavalry opened up, and it was a mess. Almost 200 people were gunned down right in the freezing snow. You can see it right here. These are frozen bodies afterwards, frozen solid because it's so cold. And they had to use, when they first tried to dig the graves, it was too cold. They used pickaxes and tried to dig through, but it was just, the ground was frozen. So this is the spring when they came back and started burying the bodies. And this would be known as Wounded Knee Massacre. And there's a reason I started with Sand Creek and ended with Wounded Knee, because they are bookmarks. It really shows what's going to happen to the Plains Indians and to all American Indians, but you can imagine, especially the Plains Indians and especially the Lakota in South Dakota, Wounded Knee is going to have very important meaning. Just Wounded Knee. And this is a shot after it. The United States Army tried to say it was a heroic effort. In fact, the most Congressional Medals of Honor ever given to the United States Army in one action was Wounded Knee. So it discredited the Congressional Medal of Honor. World War I, they would once again reestablish it as the highest award for bravery. And so when there's going to be protests for more rights on reservations, the protests will be centered the first time in 1971 at Wounded Knee. And it's in southern South Dakota. It's just to the east of the Black Hills. If you get a chance, go. It's really interesting. Well, while this is going on, this whole issue of the ghost dance, which was already dying down. Back in Washington, D.C., there's talk of what to do about these new reservations. And the people who are making the laws have no idea what's going on with the reservation. Indian agents, remember them? They would come back and give brief little testimony. Well, the decision was we're going to have to assimilate or bring them into white culture. And so a law was passed named after a senator from Massachusetts. And this will be on your list for sure on the final. The Dawes Act. To civilize the tribal members. And the thought was, if they get rid of the decadence of the tribe, they will improve. So give up the tribal membership. So if they give it up, so these people on the reservations in misery, don't forget how awful reservation life was at this time, especially, they would get a homestead, a small 160-acre land, take it out of the reservation. So going from tribal land to be given to individual private farmers so they could learn the market and farming and become like white farmers. But you notice now, and they said, that was said all the time, they could become like white people. So of course now they're dividing people up by color of skin, and that's not how it works. Especially, you can't just simply change someone's color of skin like that. This was doomed from the beginning. So a number of members of the tribe, they took these plantations, these homesteads, but most did not do it because they didn't want to give up their tribe. That's all they had left. And then most of the people who took these homesteads had no idea how to farm, and they're farming in areas where it might rain 12 inches a year. You think about farming in northeastern Montana, or for that matter, northwestern Montana, the pagan Blackfoot reservation. And so a lot of these homesteads on the reservations weren't taken. And so most land was not claimed. And a good hunk of those who did claim land eventually lost it in the next 30 years. They couldn't make it work. So now you have all this land that was surveyed off. And to the point of view of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was like, well, okay, we can't waste it. And so then they turned around and they opened it up to non-reservation landholders. It would soon be dubbed the White Land Rush. as all of these non-reservation members began to scoop up land. And you can imagine what's going to happen. The Indian agents are going to save the best land for their friends or those who bribed them, and the worst land will go to tribal members. Also, the last big area that would be scooped up would be all this area that would be land for the eastern tribes forever, Indian territory. They divvied that up at the turn of the century, and there was a land rush. And the thing was, if you went in and claimed a land, basically put your flag in a piece of land, you got that 160 acres. So there was this big land rush in Oklahoma. They literally did a thing where they fired a cannon and people just took off into land that was once promised to the tribal members. And the whole thing was, if you're in this land rush, you better get there sooner or later, sooner better than later, or you lose the land. And that is when Oklahoma is going to become the Sooner State. And all about taking land from people, blatantly taking land. Here was a sign about scooping up and speculating on land on reservations. What's going to happen today, right now, at this moment? You're going to get huge swaths of reservation land that will be owned by other, or by people on the reservation. The Flathead Reservation will be a test case of this. The Salish, the Orlel, the Kootenai, who lived, the Kootenai up here, the Salish, they were forced out of the Blackfoot at gunpoint in the 1880s and promised this land. And then immediately, once the Dawes Act passed, there was a land grab. They called it a land grab in Missoula, and they just scooped it up. We'll get to that in 1 second. So my friend who was a Cheyenne, I remember going to the reservation with him to see their grandparents once. And there were all these prosperous farms, and I'd been through there before, living in eastern Montana. They were all owned by non-reservation members. All the best land. All the land along creeks and with water. They were not Cheyenne. They were other people. So, today, 50% or more of all the land on reservations nationwide are owned by non-reservation members. And it's almost always the best land. So Montana Public Radio does this little program called The Big Y. So this is this thing from their webpage, The Big Y. And somebody asked about the land grab in the Kootenai, or for the Salish Kootenai, aka the Flathead Reservation. Here's the Flathead Reservation. So the Big Y put this map up, and so I'm stealing their map. And also, it's actually a pretty good show. People ask questions, some are kind of humorous, some are really serious questions like this. So it's a little half-hour thing that Montana Public Radio does. It's one of those, you can go on the website and listen to it like a podcast. That's how I heard it. You see the reservation? You see all the areas in white on the reservation? That's owned by non-reservation members. Look at that. Look how much of the reservation is owned by reservation members. Only about 30%. The Flathead Reservation is dominated by people who are not on the reservation. 27% of the land are owned by reservation members. And this was land promised them forever. The Dawes Act became a massive land grab. Another way to steal the last remaining land promise. So you have this area that's a reservation, and half or more is owned by somebody else. So what's going to happen to the people who are actually the tribal members? There's a reason why the poverty rate on some reservations is as high as 50%. This was policy. What's left for people if the best land is taken? So you want to know why there's so many problems on reservations. Everything from high poverty, alcoholism, and a shockingly high suicide rate. I just told you. So that's like the last final tragedy. The Dawes Act was huge. Gotta know the Dawes Act. Yeah.
That's right.
And they what?
Like they put alcohol into the reservations because
Yeah. We were making money and then said, look, I have a bunch of things.
So were there other policies around the Dawes Act that helped to exaggerate the issue?
Yes, let's get to one. It's almost like we planned this together. Oh, And that's what I said, I'll get to that law, because I'll get to that. So this would justify taking the land. Because they'd say, look, they don't know how to use the land, they're poor farmers, they can't use the land. Well, they can't use the land because you took the land. But this then would justify taking the land, and then later on justify saying, why should we help the people on the reservations? Because they just waste their money and waste their aid. Do you know what happened to them? Of course, the answer is most people don't. Speaking of what else could happen, the Burke Act. And for some reason, I accidentally erased something, so I'll type it in as I talk. This would set up boarding schools. So they literally called it Americanization, but they would force assimilate young people. They would have to go to these schools, and they would have to assimilate and act like this white person. And so children would be taken from parents on the reservations and then shipped to these boarding schools. And I gotta type this in, I forgot to do it last period. I should add, it was new, because you can't make somebody, literally make them go and turn around and say, okay, now you're like a white person. Because now you divide it by color of skin, and no, they're not going to be white because they're not of European descent. They doomed themselves, even though the big reason they did this all was to take the land. And the slogan on these was, and let me type this in and you can see it. Beat the Indian out of the child. And so the children would go there, they'd have to shave their head. Now this was meant to promote this, look how civilized. So, shave their head, get rid of, okay, it's very common, especially like Navajos, hoop earrings. You go to the pagan, and then with beads and braided hair, they had to cut all that off. And they found even as much as one bead on a pagan, a Blackfoot. One bead, they would be beaten. And it was a really big issue on this. You spare the rod, and they'll never be civilized. And so when I was talking about this years ago, there was a student I know, now she's probably in her 30s, but her mom was a pagan. And she went to one of these schools near Browning and was forced out of the home. Literally taken from her parents and could not go home until she was civilized. And she talked about how she saved a bead in one of her pockets. And they found that bead, and they took a switch, a hickory switch, and beat the bottom of her feet until they were bleeding. And when I started talking about this, she started crying and had to leave because it was so personal. And then she told the class, I'm really glad she told us, but that was a really traumatic experience. And she loved her grandmother, and her grandmother walked with a limp her whole life. And so one of the law that helped enforce this. And you would not believe how many students were sent to these camps and then immediately, or almost immediately, forcibly sent into adoption into white families. And so they're taken away from their families. And why were they were an unsuitable environment? Why was it unsuitable? Because their parents were still tribal members. That is why finally in 1971, Congress would pass a law saying that it's illegal to adopt out of reservations because of this. And that's actually, there's been major efforts to change that law. It's going to the Supreme Court because it was so abused. I hope not. And
At 1971, the law said that you can't adopt
Yeah.
reservations.
yeah, there can, but it has to be strict limitations. So they try to stop children being taken from parents, which was happening all the time. And just using the excuse, look how poor they are. They can't have their parents. Well, because reservation. And the Carlisle School was the most famous. Carlisle School, and their head of the Carlisle School was a former general. And you notice they're almost like uniforms. And this was actually in Pennsylvania, but there's some tribes all over the West. And the head of it was General Robert Pratt, and he believed in very strict discipline. He would say at a conference about this, the first time anybody would use the term racism as we know it. Racism was obviously going on, but he was the first one to actually use the term. And his saying, he had it on a plaque behind it, kill the Indian, save the man. The Carlisle School became perhaps the greatest athlete in American history. He came out of this, eventually would be Olympic gold medalist at decathlon and heptathlon. He played professional baseball, played professional football. Jim Thorpe, this incredible athlete who got out of the Carlisle School, partially because of the mistreatment. Hard to say there's a better athlete in history than him. Part of the thing is, everybody knew Jim Thorpe for the first half of the 20th century. He just didn't specialize in everything. He was just amazing. He was better than everybody at everything. He's just one of those types. So he didn't become really, really, really good at one thing. And so we're jumping right here. So what was reservation life? It's intense poverty. You basically have second-class citizens. And it would not be until 1924 that you get citizenship, which is kind of shocking. And during the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, there would be an effort of home rule. Don't have to write all this down. Just simply, they called it, so we're going to call it this, because everybody called it the Indian New Deal. Don't have to worry about the Indian reorganization. The Indian New Deal. A lot of that would be taken away during the Eisenhower administration 20 years later. Would come back to some extent, but there's reasons there are issues on reservations, especially since everything was taken away just 120 years ago. Now, this is actually Calvin Coolidge right after he signed the citizenship law. Yeah, young men were drafted out of reservations into World War I and were not citizens. It's just kind of amazing. So let's jump to a couple of things real fast. So what we have are white settlers. And as they saw it, they're moving to this land that was being used up, being wasted. Remember the Europeans kind of felt that with the fur trade, it would become even bigger after Tippecanoe. The first ones would come in would be ranchers. And this area of ranching on the Great Plains, by the way, remember I told you the majority of cowboys were actually mostly former slaves or descendants of slaves, of enslaved people. What we have is an open range cattle kingdom. And this was also for sheep. They just simply let the cattle roam. There were these massive drives of cattle that were oversupply of cattle. And they drove them up into Kansas and the railheads. And famously, there were drives all the way up to, well, right with the forming of Miles City. Miles City was a cow town from this cattle drive. And that would start to bring the cattle ranchers up to Montana. And there were wars between sheep ranchers and cattle ranchers. Most famously, if you've ever heard of Billy the Kid, he was involved in the cattle sheep wars. Montana was big cattle sheep. Sheep had certain advantages, and also you got the wool, but wool, because it's so scratchy and hot, it's more and more being replaced by cotton. Beef rots really fast. So that's a problem with beef. You have beef in Montana, how do you get it to where there's more people in Chicago? That's the problem. Things will change. And barbed wire would end the open range. 1879. You ever put up barbed wire fence and do that? Fun times, isn't it? Good times putting up barbed wire. That's how about I do that? You're folding with gloves, and the wire got pulled and cut through the gloves. That's really good times. Good times. That's hard work. I've only had to do it a few times. The people do it all the time. And well, that would begin to allow the enclosure movement. But the final death of the open range was the winter of 1886, 1887. 50, 60 below zero in the highland, winds. And that's the famous, you probably have seen this painting, the Charles M. Russell painting of a cow during this blizzard, and it was waiting for a Chinook surrounded by wolves. Has anyone seen that painting? Because I really like Charles M. Russell. That's another one. The Historical Society, it has great Charles M. Russell exhibition, and it's going to be bigger now with the new Historical Society. And the Russell Museum in Great Falls is worth, I know you have to go to Great Falls. It's tough. It's tough. Go to the museum and then get out of town quick. That's my advice. That ended it. And so what we have then is moving into the wake of this will be homesteads. 1862, they got 160 acres of land going to be taken from the tribes. And if they live on it for 5 years, so they show improvement, they live on it, in 20 years they own it. The thought was in 5 years this will keep out the speculators. It did not. Speculators still scooped up land. But this gives you an idea about some of the land. 160 acres might have worked in Ohio where it rains 40 inches a year. It's going to work in central Montana where it rains 10 inches a year. Look at what this house is made out of. What's it made out of? That's sod. Cutting out the sod and stacking it up. And yes, all the little things living in it and burrowing into it. It stayed relatively warm and cool in the summer, but if it rained, it began to wash away. This was a very sad existence. Later on, they would double the homestead to 320, but it was never enough. Never enough. The last big land rush in Montana would be here. Eastern Montana, this whole area. Anybody know when? The last big homestead rush. World War I. Food prices skyrocketed because of demand for the war. So World War I. The last big rush. And what happened to most of the homesteaders who came out? Thousands. What happened to them? If you drive in eastern Montana, you really see it, or central Montana, or on the High Line where you can see for miles. And so you take that beautiful drive. Actually, the eastern Montana is really pretty, and it's got it's got the buttes, and it's really rugged. It's just not spectacular like western Montana. But you're driving along, and you might see, growing up, I saw them all the time. Out in the middle of nowhere, it just seems really weird. Like about 7 or 8 trees, or maybe just dead trees, all in a nice little row. No creek, no river, just right there, and nothing else around. Anybody know why? Yeah, that was the windbreak for our house. That was the windbreak and all that remains of the trees, or the dead trees. So you just know, okay, didn't make it. And you start driving the rural, driving around outside of Miles City, you see them all the time because they didn't make it. And part of the reason was this is 100th meridian. Approximately here is the line of 20 inches of rain a year. They actually call this the rain line. And 20 inches is the bare minimum. So right along here, you're barely going to make it. But as railroads went through, they wanted people to move west. As you can imagine, they want a market. So as the railroads went west, they started promoting that, no, don't worry about this, basically a desert there. The rain line is moving west. It's moving. Why? Because rain follows the plow. Obviously, it's civilization brings rain. So when you plow up a field, it creates dust. Or your fires and smoke and factories, and smoke goes in the air and dust goes into the air. What does that create? Rain clouds. Thus, it brings, this is science. Do we have proof? Look at the biggest cities, New York, London, and it rains all the time there. Why? Civilization. Who can argue with that? That's cause and effect. And so the railroads went to Western United States and said, you don't want to be your miserable life in a factory, sell everything you have, go into debt, and move to North Dakota. They went to Europe and did this. So, for example, they encouraged a bunch of German farmers to go to North Dakota, telling them that the rain line is moving. Why do you think North Dakota's capital is named after a German chancellor? Bismarck. I've been to it. There's a bunch of towns in North Dakota and South Dakota with German names. I remember going through Strasburg, North Dakota. So here is selling it for the Burlington, Chicago Northwestern. I left this for the Milwaukee Railroad. went out of business in the 70s, but it's selling going to Montana, and they're plowing up gold. And they would say things like, the railroad moved 3 miles. I got really bad news for all of you. Train doesn't follow the plow.
And so does the main.
That's why don't trust science. Don't trust your science teachers. Are you with me on that? All right. Who has Mr. Phillips? Yeah, you tell him I can't trust you. Yeah, yeah. It's just like you can't trust math, right? Who has Mr. Peterson? Yeah, you make sure we can't trust you. You make stuff up. All your math teachers, tell them that. So let's jump right to this. But one thing big about this, as they move west, it also showed one other thing. They're tied to the new second industrial revolution. They need railroads to make it. Here's the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. That was one of the transcontinentals that went from basically Kansas City, then down to the south, went to Los Angeles and then San Francisco. Really prosperous railroad for a while. And railroads, by definition, in the West are monopolies. I mean, sure, there might be a few places where there's going to be one or two or three railroads, but most places in the West, there's one railroad, and the farmers are going to be tied to it. Like today. One, monopolies. And that's how come we have to get to next big heading, the second industrial revolution. Because while this is going on, things are changing fast. So let's get to the factors of the second industrial revolution. The first one was that steam revolution. So the first industrial revolution, 1830, 1850, where capitalism was invented. They're starting to create the economy we know. And what is the basis of the old industrial, or the first industrial revolution? Here's a handy acronym. What was the first thing they made in the first industrial revolution? What product? The power locomotives. Textiles. Railroads. Iron. On the right track though. And what's the main fuel at first? Coal. Textiles, railroads, iron, coal. That's pretty much it, isn't it? And they're starting to create the world we know. Up to 1860, but we still would be very unhappy in 1850. Okay, we couldn't make it in 1810. We would cry. We would just crawl into a fetal position and cry. 1850, it's awful, but at least I kind of understand things. After the Civil War, by 1900, they could drop us in that world. We'd be fine. It'd be weird, but it would be our world for the most part. There'd be a lot of things we don't have, but it would make sense completely. Then we have that Civil War coming. New business practices. That's why I have all these wagons and the white Harvey and the Potomac. New business practice, new entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, soon to be dubbed robber barons, who would get rich in the Civil War using government contracts and then use that to make capital investments afterwards. New invention. Then, I don't know why there's this shadowy thing back there. It's kind of scary, but I kind of like it too. You see the shadowy words? The labor supply went up. Immigration, also migrants leaving the farm. If labor supply goes up, what does that do to wages? It brings them down. Now, as the overall economy, that's bad. But in the short run, low wages allows for more profit, for more investment. In the long run, it won't work. If there's always oversupply of labor. Next, a much more advanced banking. The banking system really began to take off after the Civil War. Finance. The entire capitalistic system needs debt. Gotta have debt. They need the ability of easy credit. Everything operates on debt. Every business is in debt. There's $1 trillion paper market, they call it, even though it's all done on computers now, where every day, the biggest corporations in America borrow money in the morning and pay it back at night for daily operating costs. It's something, it's invisible to virtually everybody, but it's $1 trillion every day. Borrow it, give it back. You have these big like money market funds and things like that that will loan the money out for a tiny little interest every day. So if you have money in a money market account, which a lot of you might, I have some in one. They loan, those managers loan it out every day. Next, with the population going up, the market's going up. More people to buy and sell goods. Population market. By the way, that's Wall Street right there. Actually, no, that's not Wall Street. That's the commodities market in Chicago. Also, Southern opposition was gone. Southerners opposed the tariff. They opposed government aid for railroads, but now they're gone. And with the Compromise of 1877, the Southern planter class unified with the pro-business Republicans. But then let's get to the biggie. So we got this. Innovation. Massive innovation. And what it was is, we mentioned this before, innovation, technology builds another technology. And you don't have to write down the quote of Newton. I just like Isaac Newton's quote because it so fits what science is. He did not invent calculus, but he was standing on the shoulders of greats, especially Johannes Kepler, who came up with a calculus, which just basically means a formula to figure out elliptical orbits, and Newton simplified it and clarified into what we call today calculus. And so once you have some inventions, it triggers all these other inventions. And boy, once you get electricity, the sky was the limit. As you can hear from that sound being powered by electricity. That's progress. Here's one example, the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process was invented in England as a way for steel production, to rapidly increase steel production. By the way, every puddler, the skilled craftsman who did steel, would be all out of business. And here's a Bessemer furnaces where you can superheat large quantities of iron to separate and drive out the impurities, add a few things to make it strong, like nickel and cadmium, and you have steel which is significantly stronger and more durable than iron. Therefore, you need less of it, you can build taller buildings. It's no coincidence that you have the Bessemer process and better steel, and 30 years later, you have skyscrapers. Things go hand in hand. And then open hearth was taking the Bessemer process, supersizing it to a much faster and more efficient way to make steel. They still use the open hearth method for steel production today. If you have, anybody have a blast furnace at home, that's how you do it. I have one in my basement. I go home every night and make steel. So iron and steel production would be the basis, the foundation of the second industrial revolution in many ways. So look at steel production in the US, that's yellow. Look at the explosion by 1900. Steel would make the United States. Going into the 20th century, what made America a great industrial power was steel production. Not so much anymore, but we're still living off of that. So, since we got steel in the basis of it, let's get to the products on the basis of the second industrial revolution. A new acronym. This is fun, isn't it? This one's the same as the last one. What's the R? Railroad. But a new fuel. Oil. Steel. Electricity. And this one you won't get. Good guess, but no. Chemicals! Yay! Chemicals, and then out of that, it'd be out of petroleum production. The production of petroleum revolutionized chemistry. In fact, made chemistry. And out of that, you're going to get so many fun chemicals. And of course, the biggie that's going to come in the 20th century, you probably all know for petroleum production, plastic. But from distillation of petroleum, that's where you get things like aspirin. If you take an aspirin or an Advil or most multivitamins, it's petroleum. So you can just take a swig next time you get gas. And it cures you. It makes you better than vitamin C. So let's get to the next one. Refrigerated cars. It's one you don't think about as a big innovation, but this would build upon other innovations. And steel made a big deal because you make more precise vacuum pumps. And Because stuff is Swift and Zeiss Armor, here's Armor, and that's Swift right there. They didn't invent it, but their production they would invest in it, seeing that this would change the world. And it did. It totally changed the way people ate, the way people bought food, the way the people looked at food production. It changed the world. That's part of the reason why we go back to 1850. It wouldn't make sense. 1900? Yeah, because it's close to the way we eat now. Not 100%, obviously. So what does it do? It allows for centralized meat packing. So they can take cattle, or more importantly, or they cows to a centralized slaughterhouse, and then take the meat, refrigerate it, and bring it to a centralized packing place, where they could do processed canned foods. They could also cut food, preserve it. Beef, rotted, but now refrigeration, they can preserve it. Beef was not popular because you literally had to, if you wanted beef, that cow had to be slaughtered and eaten within a couple days or it began to spoil. Now it changes everything. Beef, which is also really inefficient and uses like what, 2/3 of all the water in the United States is beef production. Yeah, they just suck on water. But it turns out humans really liked it if you can have it and not spoil. Humans like it a little bit spoiled. So they can rest it, they call it age it. And they can age it because refrigeration won't spoil as fast, and let it age. And it turned out that's what humans like to eat. All of a sudden, this became more available. It changed that meat packing, now at a centralized location. And what city would become the packing plant, the meat packer to the world? Because it had so many railroads.
Green Bay.
What?
Green Bay.
Good guess, but no. Even though they didn't have meat packing, Green Bay's tiny. Chicago. Did someone say Chicago? And then Kansas City would be the other big place. Kansas City. It makes sense for Kansas City, right in the center. Kansas City, Missouri. And all the local slaughterhouses where they killed one by one, they'd be gone. Makes sense? So your connection to meat, for most people, if you eat meat, is pretty distant for the most part, 90% of the time, or 99% of the time. For some people, 100%. Before refrigerated cars, you probably walk in town, you walk by slaughterhouses there all the time. You could see the animals for the kills, hear them scream, there'd be blood everywhere. In fact, it was really common, especially for poor families. They'd send their kid to go to the slaughterhouse and get a bucket of blood. So you would add that to your food because it had protein. I don't like to think about eating that either, but that's what would happen. And now, gone, sanitized. And small producers, boom, they can't compete with this. The only small producers that remain are specialty producers. If you know, like if you're a hunter in Montana and you take it to someplace to be processed, that's really the only processors, are specialty ones who do it for hunters. And therefore, production consolidated to just a few companies and eventually monopolies. Here is Armor's, and it says, the greatness of the United States is found in agriculture, but it's all the Armor products, and they're color coding, see sheep and cattle, Montana. This is in the turn of the century. And it would go to these big slaughterhouses. Omaha was big too. I know Omaha better because my grandparents lived there. But monopolies. And what happened to the way people bought stores? Once you had refrigerated stores, once you could save it, corner grocery stores and corner butcher shops, gone. Everyone got that. You ever driven around the old parts of Helena? The parts, if you get, you're really noticeable if you get from Last Chance Golf to downtown and towards the Capitol. There are a bunch of these old, weird square buildings in the middle of these neighborhoods, and those were corner grocery stores because you had to walk and get food every day. All of a sudden now it's going to go to bigger stores and they'll be driven out, and bigger ones and bigger ones. And then once you have the cars, it's all different. People would go to the store every day. But refrigeration began to change that. And canned foods and processed food. So you have the corner ones gone, replaced by The AP was the first great store monopoly. Now the biggest store monopoly is Walmart, but it was the AP. And it's still a massive monopoly in many places of eats the Piggly Wiggly. So if anyone says I'm going to the Piggly Wiggly, has anyone ever been to a Piggly Wiggly? Am I the only one that's been to a Piggly Wiggly? We should. Let's go to Arkansas and we'll go to a Piggly Wiggly. But then I will leave you there. And soon dominated by food monopolies. What you're going to see with refrigerated cars is going to set the stage to the kind of food production we have today. Where only a few companies, literally a few, make about 90% of all the food you buy. Oh, sure, there might be different labels. They have different corporate names, but it's all owned by the same. Same with most food produced is owned by about 80%. 80% is owned by 4 companies of all the food produced on farms. 4 companies. Individual farms, companies. It's gone. Because what is it called? When the bigger you are, you have a competitive advantage. Remember that term? This is economies of scale on the grand scale. Let's get to one more. Alexander Graham Bell. He would be a classic example of the innovation. Oh, what was his lab called? Do I have that down? Oh, I didn't put that down. His lab was called Menlo Park. Let me type that in. He didn't do all the inventions. He had a team of inventors, and then he took the patents. I'm not saying he didn't do all. He did some, but he took it. That's the way most of it's done today. Corporations own most of the patents. Did I say Graham Bell? I am messed up here. I had Edison in my head.
Yeah, Edison took a bunch.
I am sorry, God. Let's do Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. He actually took 8 separate inventions. Took 8 different inventions from other people, put together for a telephone. What was the first word said on the telephone? Good guess. It was, can you hear me? And can you come in here, please? Because he didn't know if it was working. And his thought was as something to use for the deaf. For deaf people. That's what he thought. And telephone, in 1876 was invented. And it's going to take about 10 years. Few improvements, especially getting some kind of a speaker that you could actually hear it. That would be invented by Edison, Edison's lab. Once that happened, by the 1890s, telephones. Not everywhere, but all of a sudden, wow, you could actually talk to people. And there would be a continental telephone line by 1900. Good place to stop right there. Sound good? Don't write Menlo Park. I don't know why I just had Edison in my head. You know, I want all of you to do something. Enjoy the cold this weekend. You have a 3-day week and a 20. They won't let you outside? You want to play? We should go out. Let's go outside and make snow angels real quick. Who wants to go with me?
Well, my parents and my dad was like, we're not driving today, but I gotta be so good today.
No, that's probably for the best.
I drove. I'm just sad, because that's when I wanted to go.
Go to where? Oh, yeah. And now you're stuck. Goodbye, everybody! Waiting for a text from what?
What's your
Are you gonna be curious exactly how I
You got
put it?
2?
I have to leave a little bit early. What time is that?
7th is after 2:20, because 6th is at 2:20.
If you come after the bell, I'll be here. Yeah.
Because I have the quiz for Monday that I
It'll
missed.
take you 5
I'm
seconds.
gonna leave it in your-
I'll give you a chance to do it. Yeah, and that's part of the reason I wanted to make it 0, so in case we did miss it because you were gone.
Yeah, I don't know if I did it or not, or that was determined and I was because I was going to
Yeah, we did. So do this, and then all I want you to do with this is try to figure out how many What about outcome?
So what is objective why he needs that?
So try to put this back to what does he want to achieve with that?
Yeah, I write that down, so.
Yeah. Start, and I'll give you full credit, just remind me, get it to me Tuesday.
Okay, so